Hey everyone, welcome to the Wild and Uncut podcast, brought to you by Ruger. I'm your host, Kristy Titus. Thank you for tuning in. The line is going hot, so let's go full send on this episode. Across America, freedom is more than a word. It's a way of life. Generations of grit rest in the hands of those who build, defend, and sustain. Crafted to endure, tested in the wild, and relied upon at home, the next generation of the Ruger American Rifle is a bold evolution of precision and rugged reliability for responsible owners, today and for generations to come. With OnX Hunt, those who wander are never lost. Public and private land ownership, offline functionality, and 3D mapping allow me to hunt with confidence. And the elite membership comes included with draw odds and unit trends with hunt research tools, a membership to Hunt and Fool, plus a membership to Hunt Reminder to ensure you never miss a draw deadline. Download the OnX Hunt app and start your trial today. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Wild Uncut podcast. I'm here with Nephi Cole from Your Mountain Podcast, and you have you've been in Wyoming for a long time, well over 25 years in a kind of a deep-rooted history that, you know, you worked with Governor Mead. You've done stuff on the geology side, studying rocks and landscapes. So you come with such a unique perspective. It's really interesting to have you on, and getting to know you and your story too is really, really awesome.
Well, it's nice to welcome you to Wyoming, and we're out here on your place, and it's just absolutely beautiful in the Powder River Basin. And I came here actually. Initially, I graduated from Utah State University and came literally to the Powder River Basin to do soil mapping out here. And so I worked with a soils team that did the soils mapping for, you know, this general area and for the Bighorn Mountains. And I was working on a technology project, and without going into too much of a geeky detail about that, we use a lot of GIS and remote sensing to develop some predictive mapping out here. But I spent I think the first 6 years of my career in a pickup truck, driving around the Bighorns and the Powder River Basin, and it was really fortunate to be out here. And I always said, if I could figure out a way to make a living, this is exactly where I wanted to live. And
here you are.
Yeah, I didn't ever think I'd be able to. I ended up going from there to the state office for the USDA, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Mm-hmm. And I worked as what they call a watershed coordinator. So I worked on conservation planning to address impaired streams and landscapes, throughout all of Wyoming. I worked with farmers and ranchers and communities to build plans to address impaired streams and impaired water bodies, and to do stream reclamation and rebuild habitats and all sorts of stuff like that.
I could put you to work out here.
Oh yeah, you got lots.
You look around, you're
looking around. It's like I call it opportunity.
Lots of opportunities out here. We could talk about that too.
Yeah.
There's one thing that you never have enough of when you own a place like this is time or money, because the opportunities, as you call them, they're very endless, and it's fun.
Well, and I've got a buddy who has their ranch is his sons will be the 5th generation.
Sure.
And they live over on the face of the Bighorns, and it's just how it is. It's 5 generations of being out there, and literally there's projects every day.
Yeah.
And new projects every day. So it'll keep you busy out here, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, it's been busy, but I'm out here till almost dark every night, and boy, I can't imagine doing anything else with my time. I don't have children, and so it's really easy that this land has become, a Mother Earth out here.
Yeah, it's your Mother Earth,
if you will. There's always something to do. Like, last week I was really excited. I have a water tank over here that the well that was supplying it was toxic. And so we capped off that well, and I direct fed another water source to it, and we just refilled that for the pronghorn. And so I was just able to kind of make that kind of go full circle because my reservoirs and water systems don't stay year-round full. So it is really nice to live in a place like this and to be able to look at the landscape and the wildlife that call it home and try to make it a better place for them. And I think that's, being a hunter, that's really where our heart always goes is conserving resources and making them better than
Absolutely.
we found them.
Yeah, that kind of led me. In college, I drew a circle around the places that I wanted to live, and that circle was, all the places I thought I could hunt elk.
Mm-hmm.
And so my career in USDA was centered around I wanted to live in the Rocky Mountain West, and that's where I wanted to be. And the work on the watershed stuff actually was really unique because that led me to a phone call one day where I was living in Cheyenne and working with a bunch of state government and with all the conservation districts in Wyoming, and the governor's policy advisor and his chief of staff asked me to come up to the office and sit down with. It was Matt Mead's first term in office, and I went up there and I said, "Hey, what do you do?" And I said, "I'm Nephi Cole, and I'm with the NRCS, and how can we help you? Basically, this is what we do." And I just kind of gave him the spiel on how we work on these large planning initiatives, and shook hands with him and left. And a couple weeks later, I got a call from one of the people in that meeting who asked me to come back up and have lunch with him. And he said, "Hey, here's how you're going to help us. We want you to leave your job
and come to work for us.
Come to work for a governor," which was a huge change for me. And it's been a big change because it took me out of, I always thought I was just going to be a, biologist, natural resource professional for my entire career. And suddenly I was in politics. I was I did the energy strategy for Wyoming, for the governor of Wyoming. And I ended up after that doing the water strategy for Wyoming. Then I developed the Office of Outdoor Recreation for Wyoming, and I built the Wyoming Lottery Corporation, which was a lot of fun. And then, among a bunch of other different neat activities and opportunities and challenges, I was doing the governor's, Governor Matt Mead's, national stuff with the National Governors Association, where he worked on the permanent reauthorization, work on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. He really led that. On endangered species stuff, one of my colleagues was really kind of the head on that, but he ended up working to recruit firearms companies to Wyoming, and I was a huge part of that. And what I do now, I work for a large entity that represents the manufacturers, retailers, and distributors of firearms. That's my my day job. And on the side, that good friend of mine who did all the endangered species work, he's an attorney who was the lead attorney general for Wyoming Game and Fish. And then we had offices next to each other in Governor Mead's office. His name's David Wilms, and David and I, one day we went up to the chief of staff in the last year. After 7 years, it's the last year Governor Mead was going to be in office, and we had a good mutual friend, a guy named Steve Ranella, who we'd been on his podcast, and so one day we're sitting around and we were like, this doesn't seem like such a chore. So we went to the chief of staff and we said, "Hey, can we do a podcast?" And she said, "What's a podcast?"
Oh, no.
And so then we explained it, and she said, "Yeah, sure. What's the harm in that? Just don't tell them where you really work." And so that was the beginning of it. We flew out to Seattle to our friend's house, and Steve's still a really good friend, and we ended up going out and recording our first podcast. We've done 200 of them now. It's called Your Mountain. It's really a geeky podcast, so it's just all, it's all policy, and it's natural resource. You want to know how Pittman Robertson works or what FLTMA is and all those types of things. So we have a very dedicated listener base that it's really
policy driven conversations.
Just a bunch of nerds like us. And, but it's been a lot of fun because we get to stay involved in these discussions of things that are really important to us. And you mentioned being outside and hunting, and I'll tell you, that's kind of what led me to Wyoming.
And me as well.
Yeah, and I've just been fortunate to be able to be here, and now to be able to raise my 2 kids here, and it's just I just feel lucky to be, to have this, Western landscape is like the backdrop of my life.
Mm-hmm. Access is the number one reason that people either don't hunt or quit hunting. And coming from Oregon, we had a lot of public land in Oregon, but our tag system was not great. Your opportunity to hunt elk and deer in wildlife, it was just dwindling every year. And, there was a lot of hunters there, and it was just difficult. It became difficult to do what I love to do there. And then, all of the Second Amendment legislation that was, our governors were trying to pass, our legislators were trying to pass, all these bills, against semi-automatics, extended capacity firearms, it's like, excuse me, I think this is like standard. But they'd use this language to kind of fearmonger the state. And it just became a place that I no longer recognized. I didn't feel like I had a lot in common with the mass. And I came to Wyoming for a Wyoming women's antelope hunt, and Mark and Jenny Gordon were at the event. Some of the representatives from the state were at the event, and they were, Second Amendment sanctuary, constitutional carry, right to hunt and fish. This state had representatives that were supporting my values and my way of life. And then the people here, it was the same thing. And one thing that I'm a really big believer in is the power of the purse. I can't necessarily tell my decision makers, senators, lawmakers how to spend my money, but I can choose what states I'm going to put my money into. And, I want to put my money into a state that is going to try to spend my money the way I want it spent. Obviously, this is not a, complete process where we have all the control, but we do have some control here in Wyoming, and putting my money and my time into a place that supported that was really important. And, no state income tax here. It was great. So that's why I called Wyoming home, no income tax, all these extra rights. You guys, if you're watching the podcast, behind you is my gun range. So from where I'm sitting now, or where we're sitting now, you could shoot almost 1,100 yards, and this is a great place to live. I have pronghorn roaming freely, and it's a state that really supports hunting and Second Amendment. We don't live in fear daily that our decision makers are trying to take our guns and our right to not only protect ourselves, but also to be able to enjoy and recreate in wild landscapes. So that was a big deal. I think it's really important for people to never forget that you do have a choice. You choose where to live every day, and you don't have to choose to spend your money in a state that doesn't align with your values.
Yeah, it's funny. When one of the last things I did with in Matt's office was to work on trying to help companies who were trying to move to get a new foothold in a location that was going to be supportive of them. And so many governors since that time, we've seen a ton of governors coming to, for example, the Shooting Hunting Outdoor Trade Show, and recruiting companies there to try and, to create a sanctuary basically for those companies, because, there are states that, that are, openly antagonistic,
correct,
to to those companies that are trying to tax them out of existence, trying to
legislate them out of
existence. And typically the people who are doing that, it's kind of funny. You go into a big room full of people who are, arguing about, let's just say something about the Second Amendment, and it'll always frame up this way in every state you go to, and you see these arguments. On one side of the room, you're going to see people who are seeking to take away firearms, and seeking to, harm that right. And on the other side of the room, you're going to see a bunch of people who are really concerned about people trying to take away that right. And on this side of the room, on the right side of the room, what you're going to see is everybody on that right side of the room, probably everybody in there, I can tell you none of them are felons, because they all buy guns.
That's right.
And so they all, sign, 4473. None of them, commit crimes with guns, because they all value legally owning those guns. And so you'll have hundreds of people who are that way. On the other side of the room, not a single person typically owns one. And so you have a group that isn't affected by the policies that they want to push out there, that are just advocating for, telling you how scary things are and how bad they are. And when the laws or the things they want to see passed none of that affects their
Yeah.
their daily life.
But they're not end users, so they don't understand even what they're talking about criminalizing. So they don't understand how firearms function.
No, how you store them,
Exactly.
where you
And
move them to,
exactly.
what ammunition does what, and all that stuff. There is no real understanding of that, and there's no need. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the lawmakers who are making those decisions, if you're in an antagonistic state, they don't even care to try and understand those issues, because for them, unfortunately, it's actually not about, I say this about some states, like you could hand somebody a broom and tell them that's an AR-15, and they would they throw it on the ground and be scared of it and everything, and they don't know the difference, and frankly, it doesn't matter to them.
No.
Because they're never going to own it.
And if it's not black, a lot of times they're like, well, that's not one. Well,
It's really interesting.
The materials in which the firearm is constructed from also affects perception of it as well.
Yep. Well, it's really interesting as sportsmen, you run into this strange dichotomy where people are trying to make you pick, where again, they're going to take a look at a gun, and one sportsman who's a traditionalist, somebody will call him a FUD or something, right? This guy's got a gun he bought in 1950. That's awesome, And his state of the art at the time was walnut. That's great. But there's this thing where sometimes people want to freeze firearms in time, and they want to say, like, everything new beyond this point is bad.
Yeah.
And you need to, and so if you really think this, you need to, this is all sportsmen need. I don't know how many times I've heard that, statement. What do you need for hunting? It's kind of a ridiculous statement. This saying that because somebody didn't have this thing, well, then you obviously don't need this thing right now. But the Second Amendment isn't based on need. It's not based on the past. It's not predicated on any specific use. It is a right that grows over time, and it continues to mature over time, and it's not based on what your
founding fathers.
Yeah, what your uncle has in his gun safe, or his uncle before him, or his uncle before him, and that's something that's tough for people to understand. And I think that there's actually this false argument that gets set up in the sporting community, and it's going on right now, really heavy, which is you see people who have a political axe to grind. For example, there's a guy who ran for the governor of Montana. He's Democrat, and so he lost, and he's out there just hammering on, if you look at what's going on now, it's all Republicans. Republicans are bad, and if you can never vote for Republican again. And the problem is, it's this idea that somehow if you incorporate what he's telling you to believe right now, that somehow, you're going to be, the Second Amendment stuff's going to be fine. It'll take care of itself because, hey, you don't need this or that to hunt, and they probably won't touch your hunting guns. And
probably won't.
And you say that they won't, but they will. And so the reality is, as sportsmen, this is a false choice. You don't have to choose between land to hunt and the tools to hunt. It's absolutely fake. And that's the fake argument that people are trying really hard to set up right now, is you have somebody that's telling you, like, well, if you like guns, then you have to just, nothing else can bother you. You don't weigh in on these other issues. For example, conservation issues, conservation of species or whatever else, or, hunting. Like, you just need to care about the tool. And on the other side, you have people telling you, well, don't worry about the tools. You just, it's all about environmentalism and conservation. That's a fake argument for hunters. Hunters don't have to choose between the right to keep and bear arms and the places to hunt and enjoy wildlife and to conserve wildlife. That's a fake argument, and it is only the extremes that want us to buy into that. The reality is, most of the hunting public, we are the cutting edge middle. We are the razor's edge. We care about all these things, and if anybody tells you that you have to choose between one or the other, kick that guy out, because that person doesn't have your interests.
Well, one is vested in the other. Without PR dollars, our conservation programs would not be where they are today, which comes from the sale of the legal sale of firearms, ammunition, some sporting goods equipment.
It's $1 billion a year.
It's a huge amount of money, and that funds large majority of national budgets, which you can probably talk about more than me. But then hunters double down with 75% of individual state budgets coming from tag and license sales. So firearms are not only key for, personal protection, and hunting, in that regard, but they're critical for conservation efforts nationwide.
Yeah.
And that's a poorly told story, and I think some hunters don't even understand really how the funding works. And it is such a multi-tiered approach. When you look at it, you can't have really one without the other, but you need both.
Absolutely, and most people aren't aware of that. There was an excise tax in the early 1900s that hunters looked at specifically, and you had Theodore Roosevelt and a group of luminaries in the Boone and Crockett Club talking, and the National Wildlife Federation working towards figuring out how we could restore a wildlife heritage that was really lost. Throughout the nation. I think we had 25,000 elk or 30,000 elk in the entire nation. Whitetail deer numbers were really
dismal.
poor. Yeah, and turkeys, everything. You just go down the list, and there just wasn't much. And so an industry group, and I believe it was led by the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturing Institute, SAMI, and their members, put together and worked with this these forward-thinking, conservation-minded representatives and organizations to get this excise tax changed to where it became a 10 or 11%, depending on what we're talking about, whether it's handguns or archery tackle or firearms and ammunition, long guns, to get that dedicated to conservation. And so now most people don't know, when they go to the store and they buy a box of shells, every 10th shell, shotgun shell you buy, the money from that shell, the cost of manufacturing, goes to the treasury and then gets redispersed to all the fish and game organizations in the United States of America. And it's over $1 billion a year. It's about $20 to $25 million to the state of Wyoming. It's $27 million to Montana. It's the same to Colorado, and it's based on the amount of public lands that you have, and also the amount of licensed hunters that you have. And so that money then goes into their state game and fish agencies, and it's protected. The way that it's protected is it is tied by federal legislation to the license dollars, to where when you sell licensed hunters licenses, if you divert this Pittman-Robertson funding, then if you divert your hunting license money to, say, build roads or to some pet political project, you lose all of your PR dollars. And so you'll see it's almost a 50-50 split then, because that's what works, because it's a matching program where your federal dollars are matched by state dollars from licenses. And so when you look at your sportsman's license fees, those are almost, it's really close to just matching up with your PR dollars. And that's what drives all these agencies and allows them to live, is this match of, it's actually almost a tax twice. It's sportsmen, they're paying for their license fees to go hunt. And when they buy a shotgun and they buy ammunition, they are doing the exact same thing, because the manufacturers are paying for the other half the sportsmen aren't paying for with their license dollars. And it's really
a double tax.
It is the success of the of the North American model of conservation. Everybody talks about sportsmen pay into it. That's absolutely right. Sportsmen and the manufacturers, they're the ones that have bankrolled this rebound of fish and wildlife opportunity in the United States of America. Now,
it's not just sportsmen, though. It's also shooting sports enthusiasts.
Right.
Because there's a lot of people that purchase firearms and ammunition that go competitive shooting and never go hunting. That want to plink in their backyard, that enjoy firearms collections or whatever it is. They want to have the right to defend themselves, so they buy a personal protection firearm. Whatever the firearm sale is, or ammunition sale, for whatever their intended purpose is, whether they're plinking at the range or whatever, that is taxed. It's not just sportsmen that are taxed. So whether anybody laces up hiking boots or not, if they're buying a firearm legally, which is what we support, is legal transfer, then they're contributing.
100%. In fact, 80% of Pittman-Robertson today comes from non-hunting shooters. So it comes from the person who buys a firearm, from the mom who buys a firearm, and then for safety and keeps it safe in her house, or the grandmother who carries it in her purse because she lives in a bad neighborhood. 80% of funding comes from people like that who are buying handguns, self-defense guns, and taking those firearms to the range and buying ammunition and shooting that. Every time you hear a gun go bang at the range, just think to yourself, well, there's a nickel for conservation, and there's a nickel for conservation. And really it is, you said hunters don't understand. It's really...
Mainstream doesn't understand.
Yep, it's even larger in the non-hunting community.
Because every time somebody that doesn't hunt, that is an anti-hunter or just simply a non-hunter on the fence, every time they lace up their hiking boots and they hit a trail, they don't realize that gun owners are paying for that.
Yeah, when they see that elk, they don't have any clue that literally the rebound, all the elk in the United States, all that, and if you're in Tennessee and you're enjoying that opportunity, you can look at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and look at those herds there and know that hunters' dollars paid for the growth and expansion of that herd, so they were able to move some of those animals and basically bring them back to where they came, to where they used to be, and recover those herds.
There are a lot of Americans that understand the value of hunting, but we all know that right now, national support of hunting is extremely volatile. It seems that with every passing day, our voice is diminished and the court of public opinion is not effectively hearing our side. We need advocates working on our behalf in Washington, D.C. to defend our freedom to hunt. And thankfully, when we need it the most, we have that advocate in Safari Club International. SCI's world headquarters are located in Washington, D.C., just blocks from the United States Capitol, which means that SCI is on the ground with our congressional leaders and federal agencies on our behalf, on behalf of the hunting community. SCI has an active political presence in all 50 states through their extensive chapter network and government affairs staff. If you have ever wondered why you should be a member of SCI, you shouldn't wonder anymore. Join us in the fight to defend hunting. Go to safariclub.org to learn more.
And I think, it doesn't go without saying, too, that the third way that hunters truly contribute is through nonprofit organizations like, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation or your Ducks Unlimited or your Safari Club Internationals. So those organizations are also out there that are doing habitat improvement work, and those people are generating funds that are helping as well. RMEF has been a true champion in acquiring private land, which sounds really weird, but they have funds where they'll acquire private land that will then they turn over to either a state, BLM, or federal agency into public holdings so that public can use those points to access. So they're opening up access with some of these purchases, and they're not buying these end holdings to acquire and hold as an organization. They'll buy them and turn them over for public use so that they can open up access. So when you join some of these organizations, your money is going to those projects. Your money is going to riparian work, water guzzler work, fence removal, all kinds of projects that also, hunters really put a threefold down on what they're doing. I mean, we see it at some of these banquets. The Mule Deer Foundation banquet this year, the Wild Sheep Foundation banquet this year. These tags are now selling. I think the sheep tag went for nearly $1 million this year, or it went over $1 million. It was like $1.1 million. Deer hunts are selling for over $600,000, and a lot of people are like, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. This is becoming a rich man's sport." Well, this is a one-off tag. That all that money is going back on the ground for those agencies, and so we do so much more than meets the eye, and not only improving access, improving habitat, improving wildlife numbers, and we're all doing it in a sustainable and an ecological manner that benefits generations to come.
Absolutely, and I love that you mentioned Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation, Ducks, and these other groups, because that work that they do, it's the members joining that membership, it's more than just money, and people need to understand that. When they do that, they join those organizations, it's just like joining the NRA.
Sure.
Or whatever group, because those organizations, when they can walk into a congressman's office and they can say, like, yeah, I have X number of
members that we're representing.
Yeah, and these people vote. That, we call it political economy. The political economy there, we think about money in politics, but what the real thing that the politicians care about is it's the number one, and it's represented by each individual that has one vote for that election. And it's really critical that we join these organizations and support them, because those organizations, they do great work on the ground. But Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, for example, Ryan Bronson at Rocky Mountain Elk does a phenomenal job of visiting with those decision makers and making them aware of things that are important and things that are concerns, and what's the pulse of the sportsman and what do they care about. And so your dollars, when you join those organizations, you're helping keep, not just boots on the ground. You're putting suits, it's not just boots, you're putting suits into those congressional offices to help them make decisions that represent where you're at as a hunter and conservationist.
Well, you think of a group like Safari Club International, you think, well, they're only supporting international hunting. SCI has their corporate headquarters in Washington, D.C. They have a legal team that is on site, and they have an advocacy team that's doing tremendous work in Washington, D.C. daily. They just came out this week on there's this, obviously we're talking about some public land, and obviously Mike Lee put in the big beautiful bill, the potential to sell off 2 to 3 million acres of public land, and SCI is on the ground in Washington, D.C. trying to talk to them and talk them out of that this isn't good for the average hunter, this isn't good for the public landowner, and in all fairness, they're stealing from us, in my opinion. And this is land that's owned by the public, the money belongs to the public, and it should be a public decision, and getting in front of these people and having organizations that represent large numbers of members gives them a lot more standing, if you will, when they have their suit on and they go shake that hand.
Absolutely. It's it's interesting that you brought that up. The concern about sales of public lands right now. There's a real history there, and already you saw over the weekend tweets from the senator Mike Lee saying, it touched a nerve, and he was getting these groups, even groups that he assumed Utah-based groups were going to be on the same side as him, or telling him like this isn't the right way to do it. And I think that that's what a lot of people, when you look at the proposal in the big beautiful bill, there is already a process for selling federal lands, and that process is set out really well in FLTMA and FLTFA, and these Federal Land Policy Management Act and the Federal Land Transaction. I'm going to mess up this acronym, but that act as well. And so, if you were to look at how that's done in the past, the way to do it is that there are these forest plans and RMPs that divide lands into different buckets of how critical it is and what is suitable, quote unquote, for disposal and these other things. And then there's a public process that comes in behind that for a federal land sale, where if they actually think that it's important to transfer lands, they're going to go to the public and they're going to solicit public feedback on every one of those parcels. After they do that, they're going to do evaluations. They're going to do, there's going to be opportunity for discussion on this. It has to meet certain requirements, and a lot of those requirements, when you look at the original version of the proposal that Lee put out there, there's some pieces of that. Some of that language is borrowed and carried over on things like, for public benefit and sales on. And again, this is the existing version. I'll talk about that in a second that people have seen, but the need to consult with local governments, the sold at fair market value, and all these types of things. Well, that's a moving target.
Sure.
And it's a moving target because, and I think that, as Lee said in his text, he said, I heard you, changes are coming. And I believe that was the wording of his text.
Something to that nature on his text, yes.
So here's the challenge that people need to, really pay attention to. Everybody needs to pay attention to is what are the changes? Mm-hmm. And so one of the challenges, Congress moves slow on purpose. It was designed by our founding fathers some of these things that frustrate us, which are things like, the entire process and the filibuster and all these traditional encumbrances that they've made it so that people have to find an agreement. So they have to get into the weeds and they have to talk about it. And it takes years. It takes a long time. Well, the challenge with, this proposal was it came at very short notice. It literally came, and I think in the middle of the night when it finally got entered in. And you don't know who's had a hand really in crafting that. And if changes are coming, you don't necessarily know who's had hand in crafting that either. The one thing that it's fairly safe to say is that we have a federal process already. And if people stick to that federal process, you're going to get to weigh in.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get to talk about it. That there's going to be a discussion of, should we sell this? And if we do, one of the things that FLTFA does is says that money is going to then go to buy new lands. It's going to go to find, to create access. That wasn't the case in Lee's proposal. In Lee's proposal, what you were going to see is the money from those sales of roughly 3 million acres. You got about 480 million total public lands that we access through Forest Service and BLM that were on the table. And then the proposal said mandated within 6 years, it mandates the sale of 0.5 to 0.75% of those. Now, it didn't say an acreage. And so then you got to go do the math yourself. And you end up, 0.5% doesn't sound like a lot. 3 million acres, it's Connecticut sounds like a lot when you frame it that way.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of people that are saying, like, we get to have a voice in this. And sportsmen's organizations certainly have already.
Yeah.
They're making their voice heard. And it just, you just think this is a process that probably deserves a whole lot of attention. And, I think that a great example is there's a map running around out there right now from the Wilderness Society that's totally incorrect.
Yeah.
That map is not right. It is not a good map. It was made by an assumption of, it throws out all the lands that could be considered ever for, that's not those aren't the acres that this proposal was actually talking about. Those are, they're way more expansive. But the problem is what they did is they exaggerated. When you exaggerate like that, it takes away the value of the sportsman's voice because we have a legitimate beef.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, we can't be putting information out there that's fake information or else we lose our argument because people say, like, the Wall Street Journal comes out and says, well, these guys they're blowing this out of proportion. This map out there isn't true. Well, the Wall Street Journal's true in saying that the map is wrong, but that doesn't mean sportsmen are blowing their concerns out of proportion. And so you have to, we have to be careful in how we deal with this. But I think that the professionals from RMEF and Safari Club International, they're doing a phenomenal job of getting like an accurate, strong message across. Mm-hmm. And that's why you're seeing change. I think it's interesting, if you're interested in like the history of this, why is Mike Lee doing this? People need to understand the history. It's deep.
Yeah.
Utah, this probably...
This is something that Mike reverts back to. I feel like every 5 years he's doing a land grab. And I think the biggest issue with some of this land grab, and we'll go into the history in a second, but in today is how they're spending the money. So they're stealing these, they're wanting to steal these public lands without going through the process, right? So they were trying to grab this land, not giving it the process for public commentary, but then they're taking the money to fill the coffers of irresponsible treasuries instead of saying, okay, well, we're going to sell these public lands that you own, but guess what? We're going to use that money to improve public places. They're not doing that. They're saying, okay, we're going to steal these lands from you. We're not going to give you a vote. We're going to take that money and we're going to spend it how we want because we're irresponsible. We're not budgeting correctly. If I ran my household like the government, I would be bankrupt.
Yeah.
Right? I don't have the borrowing power of the U.S. government.
Yeah. No,
and so that's the issue. And then we look at things like this corner crossing in Wyoming, which is now at the level of the Supreme Court. where, now they're saying, well, maybe you can cross a corner. Well, so does that now, if we get that passed and then these landowners, which are up in arms over it, start throwing a fit to the state agency or BLM, are they going to start pushing for those chunks of land to be sold? And then we go into this minutia of, well, I don't even know minutia is the word, but we go into these little tiny pecking pieces of, okay, well, we have 80 acres here, we have 80 acres here, we're going to start selling this and that. And pretty soon it just catapults across, these western landscapes that have so much public land that is quote unquote checkerboarded or whatever. And now, well, that checkerboard's not usable. So, we should sell all of that. And so it starts becoming this larger problem. Instead of giving sportsmen more access by allowing access through corners, now we're just, we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to give you the access, but now we're going to take these and just start selling them. And we're not going to let you talk about it. That's what it feels like. I could be totally off base, but I don't feel like I am.
No, if you look at the first proposal that came out, and I think you have to step back and remind everyone, this is a moving target. So you don't actually know, because there isn't a final, this draft language hasn't, some people have seen it. Certainly we haven't, the general public.
We can only speculate the details of and the devil is in the details.
Yeah, what is the change?
Yeah.
One of my favorite phrases in politics is, does your content match your intent? Mm-hmm. Because somebody says like, well, that's not my intention when I brought this language in a bill. Well, it doesn't matter what your intention was, because 10 years from now when somebody reads that bill, it doesn't matter your intent. It matters the content.
That's correct.
And so when you looked at the content of some of these original proposals, there were, it starts out as if there are certain, there was discussion of affordable housing, but that's actually not mentioned in the bill. And then your lands were primarily, close to, they were degraded lands next to existing, I don't recall the exact language, but, existing communities. And it was, really what it looked like is it was primarily going to be like your foothills, your hills around existing towns where you had, federal land. And then there's a process for local governments, state governments, and other interested parties, which is really interesting, verbiage to nominate parcels for sale. And then they also had, as primary areas, lands that were, in addition to kind of these closer areas that were that were difficult access areas, or
again goes to the checkerboard. Yeah,
and here's the problem with that. Some of those things, we jokingly, Dave Williams and I on the Your Mountain talked about is we have an organization. Jokingly, our organization is the Front Country Hunters Association, mm-hmm. which is you have BHA. Well, we're FCHA, which is any place we can get in our truck after work and drive to and go whack a pheasant.
That's where people go on the daily. It's not always this backcountry deep thing. It's the places that are really close to home, which is why we live where we live. So we have more places close to home.
We're pretty lucky that way. And, but there's so much nuance that's gonna go into this argument. And I think that it's just the most important thing for people to do is to weigh in. Mm-hmm. The most important thing is, you had it. Interestingly enough, if you look at Montana was excluded from the proposal. The reason Montana is excluded from the proposal is because the representatives there, they've heard on their phones, Ryan Zinke knows that Montanans have no tolerance for it. Yeah. And so Zinke stood up in the House and said, this is my San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt reference. He said, this is not happening. And so, interestingly enough, then you had whoever crafted the legislation, you had 11 Western states with Montana carved out. And, the idea is like, you already know that Montana's going to be a squeaky wheel on this. We don't want to argue with those guys.
And the rest of us need to follow suit.
Yeah, well, Idaho did. Mm-hmm. So Idaho's senators are already, I believe that's the case, that they have said like, not right for Idaho either, and other folks will do the same thing when they hear from their constituents. And correct. It's important when you call them, don't curse at them, don't curse at the the old lady who answers the phone. Be courteous and pass that stuff along. And something that's really accurate is, having been to DC and worked in DC a little bit, when you get up there, you're working with a bunch of folks in some of those offices. You literally have staff in a Western office who's never driven on a gravel road because they're not from here.
Yeah.
They haven't, they don't understand these issues. And that's a problem on Western issues in general, but specifically on this public lands issue. If you've got people that have never lived in one of these states,
they don't even have a clue.
They don't get it. They really don't get it. And
No.
so
The other thing you can request is a response letter. So, like, I left a message at Senator Barrasso's office, and I asked him to send me a letter back. Let me know how you feel about it. I want it in writing to let me know how you feel about what Mike Lee is proposing. And hold them accountable to that, too, because don't just leave your message and just be like, well, I hope they got it. Make them respond to you. Be professional and get it in writing. That way, later on, when you go to the vote, you're like, well, I had it in writing on how you were feeling about this, and that's not how you voted, or that's how you did vote. You can kind of hold them accountable to that in that regard as well.
Yeah, and I think that in most cases, I talked about political economy. That's really important. And if those politicians and their staff, if they do the calculus, they run the math, they look at that political economy, their boss wants to still be there working for that state. They're going to look at the number of votes and how people feel about that, and it'll matter to them. And the one thing I'd say is those kids, they may not understand it. So don't hesitate to call your local office. If you look at all those senators and congressmen, they'll have local staff, people from the state, somebody that probably knows the congressman and has known them for 20 years. And so if you can talk to that person on the phone versus, the 25-year-old kid who's just there out of convenience, like, you're probably going to get, that person probably has a direct line to John Barrasso, and they're going to have a conversation, and they're going to tell him, like, look, this is the feeling out here in the countryside. This is how, people in Buffalo are talking to me about that, and that has an oversized impact on how people feel, because that ultimately shapes what they think the reality on the ground is. And if you can weigh in on that in a positive way, you're going to make a difference.
Same with some of these petitions, like SCI just launched a petition, and it's easy. You just plug and play, enter your information into the petition, and they automatically send the letters for you as well. And so that's a great way to have an articulate message crafted for you, and it helps support the organization to say, hey, SCI can now go to in Washington, D.C. and meet with these various decision makers and say, okay, we had 5,000 members that signed this, or 15,000 members, or 100,000 members that signed this, and really make that impact. And it's very strong.
Absolutely. And it's bipartisan. So I don't want people to think that this argument, unfortunately, again, like I've said, this is being used. It's just like, you don't have to choose between, public lands and guns. You just don't have to choose. Even though, if one political party disingenuously is trying to make you feel like you have to choose, you absolutely don't.
No.
And I think it's important to back up and understand, where Mike Lee, for whatever reason, he's really holding on to the sagebrush wars.
Sagebrush wars. That's literally what it is. I fof like that, yeah.
That's the Sagebrush Rebellion. If you look at it during the 1970s, it was right after the passage of some of the early environmental requirements for NEPA and those types of things. You had specifically in the state of Utah, there was a real strong push to turn federal lands into state lands, and that was led by a guy named Orrin Hatch, who's now passed away. Because
once it goes from federal to state, the state can make the decision to sell.
Yeah, well,
you can have a land transfer that way as well.
And absolutely. Now, but to be fair to Utah, like, does that necessarily mean that's going to happen?
Yeah.
Some people in Utah who have been involved in starting this saying, absolutely not. All we want are good neighbors. And so to understand where they're coming from, Jimmy Carter's president, they see, Utah's a big extraction state. They see projects getting cut down. They see roads being closed. They see, if you're in a county that has primarily federal lands, well, you pay taxes on your slice of paradise.
That's right.
And if you're in a spot where you're a county and you have to make roads, And you look at what the federal government paid at the time. This was even pre or just at the beginning of payment in lieu of taxes. So there wasn't a lot of benefit to having that federal land. If you couldn't use it, for something, then you just, to your process, your thought process, you said, oh, it's literally just a burden. I think that's changed. I think the perception on that has changed, but that doesn't mean that the argument changed. And it bubbles back up every time a Democrat is in the White House. Mm-hmm. And to be fair to, the Mike Lees of the world, they give him ammunition. And here's how they do it. If you look at Grand Staircase Escalante, if you look at Bears Ears, you look at these are national monument designations under the Antiquities Act where millions of acres in Utah were encumbered under a protection that made them very difficult to use and excluded a bunch of different, it's no longer true multi-use lands. Well, those were done without asking the local governments in Utah. They didn't consult, they didn't discuss it with the governor's office. People in Utah were opposed to it. And so you had an overbearing federal government entity come in and really just crack down, and in a way that made Utah upset. Mm-hmm. And so this is the pushback you get from that. The pushback you get is Utah filing a lawsuit saying we want to buy all these lands. Now, I think that there's arguments about there. Is that a good idea or not? What's Utah going to do if they get them? Can they afford them or can't they? Well, all those arguments, they're a moving target too.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of them are because the federal government's not managed them properly, and that the state has a better ability to keep a pulse on what the residents of that state want for those lands. And so, in some opinions, in fairness, a lot of state agencies are in good faith trying to acquire that from a federal position, so they feel like they can better manage those lands.
There's an easy
However, a lot of people believe by state ownership of those lands is the first step towards privatization.
Yeah. And they may be right. And,
yes.
And the challenge is, you look at the Lee proposal, and the Lee proposal says, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sell it at fair market value, and then states, in every case, in Lee's initial proposal, fair market value, states get first whack at it. Mm-hmm. They get first right of refusal. Well, if you're talking about an acre out by Wamsutter, Wyoming, well, what's the value of that acre, dollar per acre? Probably not a lot. If you're talking about ground around Park City, Utah, you start to get pretty expensive. Ground around Jackson Hole, Wyoming, you start to get pretty expensive. And then the question has to be, can states A, afford to buy it? Mm-hmm. And then B, can they afford to manage it after they buy it? And so when you look at the diversity of these lands, those are real questions that come into play. And with this proposal, Lee's proposal, perhaps the bug is the feature. Mm-hmm. It's so, it's not really clear what lands these are. It's not really clear everything that's going to happen, who's going to do it. Well, that gives you the flexibility. If you know exactly what it is, and here's the problem with the map I talked about that was so specific that it just wasn't accurate. We don't actually know exactly where these lands would be. And so the issue is then it makes it pretty hard to make an argument either way. Mm-hmm. We probably should know before somebody makes a final decision
on whether to sell.
That's exactly right, and that's what FLTFA is intended to do. Is FLTFA asks for, because ultimately, if you're a Western hunter, if you're an American at all, I find it funny that the Montana, we excluded Montana from this. But here's the thing: if you're a citizen in the state of Montana, your public lands aren't just in Montana.
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
That's right.
They're here. If you're a citizen in New York, even if you've never been to these places, so you don't understand them.
You can come here anytime. It's your public land.
Yeah. And that's what's unique, and that's the part that's tough. If we do have budget issues in this country, and if we think that here's how we're going to solve our budget issues is we'll sell the farm, well, you're never going to get it back. Mm-mm. They don't make new mountains. Mm-mm. There won't be any more. Yeah. And so once these things are gone,
we're talking wildlife corridors, we're talking winter range habitats, we're talking places that, we don't even know the implications. We see so much urban development in these winter ranges and the severe ramifications on the wildlife that inhabits those places that some people consider junk land. It's not junk, not necessarily. There is cases where it's important to sell land, and it does better best use practices for that land. I'm not saying I'm opposed to all land transfers. I mean, I don't feel like that's a valuable position to die on either. But it, again, let's identify these. Let's talk about it.
There's a process.
And then let's talk about where the money's going. What are we paying for with this?
Yeah.
You know?
And I think
if you're from Oregon, chances are you're paying for stuff that you don't want to be paying for with your budgets. That's why I moved. So this goes back to a much bigger issue of you're paying for propaganda or policy that your values may not support, and you're going to sell your public lands to fund that, and that's where it becomes a big issue also.
Yeah, it's a unique question mark if Oregon buys. In fact, there are some states, if they did make the choice to purchase it in Colorado, that's not sportsman accessible anymore. And so it's a unique time, and it's something everybody needs to keep their eyes on. My guess is, by the time that you release this podcast, there's probably going to be a whole new proposal out there.
Well, I'm trying to turn and burn this one. This is be the 100th episode of the Wild Uncut podcast, and I don't think I've had, this is a very important time. So we're going to try to turn it around really fast, because they're pushing for a vote on this by 4th of July.
Absolutely.
And here we are, June. What is today? June 20. I don't even know.
There's some really great stuff in that bill too, and this is the in the big beautiful budget bill, whatever you want to call it. I will tell you straight up, for sportsmen and firearms owners, there's really good things in that bill. It's one of the things I think it's unfortunate about this argument is like you can't have this be what the hill that Ryan Zinke has to die on.
That's right.
That then doesn't allow him to go forward with supporting all those other great things. And that's, this is this challenge that we run into. And like I said, the best thing you can do is, if you depending on how you feel about it, it's to reach out to those offices that represent you and say, hey, just a reminder, I'm your constituent. I'm a voter. I'm that one that you're trying to keep in your camp. Please listen to me and please consider my feelings on this. And it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. And how easily can they separate this out of that bill? Is it even possible?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely. In fact, I think one of the interesting things about the argument is we got to be careful about how we talk to each other, how we talk to our representatives, because as quickly as that proposal dropped into the bill, it can be gone.
Yeah.
And so that's just the nature of the reconciliation process that it's in right now. It doesn't require the same standards. It doesn't require the same hearings, and that's why this could just suddenly show up that you have in the normal congressional process. And so, literally, as quickly as it showed up, it can be gone. And the reason you have to watch it is it can change. It can change that fast too. You can have a proposal that this proposal disappeared in the House because of Zinke's stand, because Zinke stood against it. Well, if Dave and I on the podcast, we were talking 8 months ago when Utah filed the lawsuit, we were talking about how this looks like a leverage play. This looks like the Supreme Court's not going to pick this up. That lawsuit's not going to go away, but what is this really? Well, Utah's really tired of the state being taken from them piece by piece under, in Wyoming, you can't designate federal monuments in Wyoming under the Antiquities Act because Cliff Hansen, former governor and senator, when they designated, there was one that they designated, and he said, by the way, we want to carve out now. You're not going to do that to us. And so in Wyoming, it can't happen. And I think Utah, my guess is, this is just purely me thinking, Utah probably wants similar types of protections. And they would probably and I think we all would, if federal agencies, quite frankly, you have this neighbor problem where federal agencies, if they were just like every other neighbor and in the county, it wouldn't be an issue. If county commissioners could weigh in and get some and get the federal government to listen to them like the state government does or like other landowners do, well, it wouldn't be an issue. The issue is when you have a giant landowner like these western states, Nevada and Utah and even Wyoming and Idaho have, that doesn't necessarily listen, especially depending on who's in office. When Trump's in office, they probably, honestly, a lot of the argument goes away. Why? Because the agencies tend to listen to the local government because rural America tends to be, to support that conservative party. If you have a switch where you get a party that drops in and their priorities aren't shared by those rural interests, then this argument, the Sagebrush Rebellion, becomes real again. And that's why the Sagebrush Rebellion pops up under Carter, under Clinton, under Obama. That's why it happens at those times, because those rural landowners feel like those agencies change their priorities and don't listen to the priorities of those conservative rural states under those, administrations. If we really want to fix this, the way to fix it is quite simply to be better neighbors, just have those agencies make sure that they're in consultation with those governors and they're listening, because Utah, they don't want, it doesn't matter who owns the title of the land. That's not really what people want. What they want is to be able to utilize that land for the benefit of the people in their state in a positive way. And so if you can find that common ground and people feel like that's happening, you'll eliminate these things. And ultimately, that ought to be our goal. We want our public lands to remain public lands, and part of that is that they remain multi-use lands. That's part of the danger of this proposal. That's why you have ag now coming out against this proposal, is because in a version that was floated, which wasn't the original version. The original version said if you had a grazing lease that you couldn't sell it. But then there was discussion that somebody said, well, we have this other version that's now going to be the version that eliminates that protective language. And so ag said, well, wait a minute.
Now we're out. Wait a second.
That's right. And that's the magic of America's public lands. And even as sports, and we need to remember it, we share them. We share them with hikers. We share them with mountain bikers. We share them with people who take pictures. We share them with grazing. And if we're all willing to just share them, we can keep them. It is by being covetous of those lands and the uses and saying we don't want anybody else here that we ultimately lose. Put ourselves in danger of losing them.
Yeah, we lose. We have to look at it, like you said, as a bipartisan approach.
Absolutely.
Because we're all here for the betterment of the best use of the same resource. Regardless, and it's such a full circle thing. So we're going forward. Hold on, before I get in this next question, I just want to make sure nothing's overheating. Hold on, because that is also an issue. We're still good there. We're still good here. Okay.
All right. Podcast is still going.
Well, the other day everything was got like 100 degrees or 90 something degrees, and my cameras both overheated. So I want to make sure that we're good. So going forward, what can the general public do, to best serve the future? How do we stay the most involved? What's the best course of action for us all to take? Because you've been watching this for 8 months. That was one nugget I took out of this conversation. I was like, wait a second. How is this just getting on everybody's radar when this has been a rumbling for 8 months? What are we doing wrong as sportsmen and women because we're missing the boat until it's halfway to sea?
Yeah. Well, here's the big thing. We've been talking about it for a long time, just because, and we've said this on multiple, Your Mountain podcast, Dave and I, is you can't just, it's these organizations do a good job. So join the organizations. Join Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation if you, no matter where you live. Do the same thing with, these other organizations. Join the NRA.
SCI, NRA.
And weigh in there and make sure they know what you care about. And at the same time, listen to those organizations. And when they put out the call, make sure that you respond to the call. If it's all hands on deck, kind of like this is. But these issues don't go away.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest, everybody had a giant party in the NGO community when Zinke took his stand in the House. I'm like, we got this. And literally Dave and I on the podcast were like, watch what Lee does in the Senate.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you need to remember, is that this issue is never truly going to be gone. So care about it for 365 days. And make sure that you are supporting organizations that care about it 365 days. And the same thing goes for your Second Amendment rights.
Sure.
Right now, everybody's just kind of, they're laying down, they're sleeping. That we've seen it where, people are like, oh, well, there's somebody different in office, so I don't need to care about, is it legal for me to own, a semi-automatic firearm with a detachable magazine in my state. Well, Trump's in office, I don't need to worry about it. No, you need to worry about it.
100% all the time.
You got to care about it, and you got to educate people about it. And so it's really about missionary work. That's why you do your podcast. That's why, frankly, 200 episodes of the Your Mountain podcast, which we don't monetize because we're idiots. That's the idea, is that we keep talking with people about these things, because because building an intelligent, base of people around
Informed.
an informed public, is how you deal with these things the next time.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as we quit being smart, as soon as we're dumb and we're, as soon as our arguments are a map that doesn't work right, then we lose.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we lose our integrity and our credibility and our voice. And so that's the most important thing you can do. Reach out, talk to people, and then learn about these issues all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And be a missionary for public lands. Be a missionary for hunting. Be a missionary for firearms. Go find people that don't just look for the guy that drives the exact same truck as you and has the right sticker on the back and make him your bro. Look for the guy that isn't there yet,
Mm-hmm.
and invite him into your community and, grow it. That's a difficult thing in the outdoor space right now too, because you even have people in our community who are advocating ending R3 and are saying, no, don't bring anybody else hunting, and don't tell them about the trailhead, and that selfish attitude, it's what kills us on these issues ultimately.
Yeah.
It's the thought that I really like public lands, but I only like them for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you lose them. I really like hunting, but I only like it for me. That's how it goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And so be willing to be selfless enough to understand that, you're not always going to get the best tag. Next year, somebody else is going to get it. But if you're not willing to share it every once in a while, your kids aren't going to get the tag.
The other thing, too, I think, if you look at hunting as a whole, if a kid comes from a hunting family and the dad hunts, they have like a 50% chance of also becoming a hunter. When the mom gets involved, the statistic goes up for the rest of the kids in the family. But even if the mom and the dad come from a hunting family, 100% of kids from that hunting family don't necessarily engage in hunting. So it's also really important to reach out into your community. Maybe both your kids don't want to hunt, but maybe your kid has a buddy that wants to go. In fostering that, maybe their buddy comes from a non-hunting family. I think it's really important to be a good steward and invite other people in. If you know a single mom, I did a really tremendous program where we took kids that were from single parent households for various reasons. Some kids' dads were in prison, some kids' parents were addicts, different reasons, and we took them doe hunting. And the kids harvested does, they field dressed their own doe, and they brought that meat home to their mom or their parent. And I can tell you the gratification for that kid to go from being a dependent to a provider changed their life. And that is so important, to take a kid, especially a formative kid in those young years, to, kids sometimes, they feel the weight of pressure of finances and, the cost of food and the expense. And if they can become a provider and contribute, it fundamentally transforms them. So really, I encourage people to do that as well. Get out in your communities and be stewards. And there's so many great organizations out there. There's a program called First Hunt Foundation, which is really active here in Wyoming. And it's any age, anybody that wants to go on their first hunt. They've had women go in their 70s on their first hunt. They've never been. And encouraging that. It'll all go back to PR dollars. It goes back to conservation. It goes back to being a good steward. There's so much for that, and there's so much we need that. And Randy Newberg, he gets a lot of flack for being so willing to share information. But look how many lives that man has changed. I mean, he has done so much for the sport of hunting, and really has a hand in helping transform landscapes, in my opinion.
He's a great human being, and I think there's this pushback on Instagram now, like these little tiny little nugget cult groups that are anybody that is out there. they want to just tear these people down, you know, whether it be Randy Newberg or Steve Ranella or whoever else, just because they're bringing, I mean, they don't say this, but it's because they're bringing people into hunting. It's because they're making it popular. They're making it cool.
Or they're empowering them with resources.
And we don't want those guys. And to them, I would say, like, I mean, I actually don't care what they think. They're in the wrong. And here's why they're in the wrong. You know, you mentioned, you know, kids who don't get to hunt. Well, like your friend, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are involved in hiking and backpacking, or shooters who are like people who are like one piece short, like they're one key short from unlocking how cool hunting is. And here's what I would say. If you look at the history of our country, the wildlife uniquely in America, just like these public lands, is really unique. The public lands in the United States of America, they uniquely belong to all of us. So does the wildlife. It belongs to all of us. And so for those folks who would say, I want you to protect public lands, but I just want you to protect them for me. I want you to protect wildlife, but I just want you to protect them for me. It's a backwards way of thinking. When the founders came here, the idea was that this place, well, the things that were just reserved for the nobles and the kings would be available to everybody, to all of us. The right to keep and bear arms belonged to all of us. The king's game actually belonged to all of us, and that's the whole idea why. And so when you look at these things, just remember that right that you care about, the right to defend yourself, that right belongs to everybody, regardless of what town they live in, regardless of what color they are. You know, it belongs to everybody.
You go to Europe, it's a different world.
Absolutely.
The perception of wildlife and land, and you see a lot of these people that have never been in a wild place or a wild space, and a lot of kids that have never been around domestic livestock, let alone wildlife. They're terrified of them. It's wild. It is wild how scared these people are of the most beautiful resources we've had because they've never been around them. They're completely oblivious to the beauty that's in it, and it's just fear.
For all those people that think that, you know, this is a good gust. For those individuals who believe that, again, they believe that, you know, a big bull elk belongs to them, just remember, there's a kid in Philadelphia somewhere who's never had that chance, never had that opportunity, never seen one. And my goal, I think it's totally fair that if that person has an opportunity and they said, like, once in their life, you know, these animals that belong just as much as that to them as they do to me, they want to come hunt. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if and frankly, you being in line because, you know, you've already shot, you know, I've already shot lots of big bulls.
Yeah.
That doesn't give me more of a right to shoot the next bull. It actually probably gives me less. I should probably be more, I know that I should be more willing to let somebody else take a crack at that too, and to share that with them. And you know, that's what we want. And if we want, you know, our culture, the Lewis and Clark culture that's made us who we are, if we want that culture to continue in this country, then we have to share that with everyone.
There's a saying, and I'm going to totally botch this, but it's you love what you know and you conserve what you love, something to that regard. And it's true. People are not going to become vigilant conservationists if they don't know the wild landscape. You don't fight and try to defend and protect something that you don't love. And that is what is so important to connecting people, you know, getting out of the cities and getting back into nature and having these places for people to access. And like I said earlier in the podcast, access is the number one reason that people quit hunting or don't even go, is because they don't have anywhere to go. I mean, there's so many people that are on the East Coast that, like, man, I'll never hunt elk. Well, why not? Just apply for a tag, come out. You know, it might take you as a non-resident in, like, let's say Wyoming, it might take you 6 years. But what else are you going to be doing in 6 years? Or you go to a state like Colorado that has, you know, still general over-the-counter tags. Go have those experiences. There's no reason that everybody can't know wildlife and wild places.
I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, and that's something that we have to transform and get people reconnected with, because, you know, concrete lifestyles, you know, there are people that appreciate those, that love to come find solitude in the mountains, but there are people that come here that, you know, this is where they get lost and live, and we are the ones really trying to defend that. But we have to get those people that have never been here. We have to reach those individuals. And if we don't, we're all in really big trouble.
That is at the heart. That is the very heart of what really makes an American.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you look at in the world where people's like, oh, those cowboys, those whatever else, when they talk about us as Americans, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
It is that frontiering nature in us that's been there since, you know, the beginning, and we're lucky with these public lands and opportunities that those have been, you know, Theodore Roosevelt talks about it. It's like we actually kept little pieces of them so that we can experience, at least on the weekends, we can experience a little bit of what it was like in the very beginning. And that's an opportunity that if we lose it, we'll never get it back.
I like the idea of protecting those front country hunting opportunities. You know, those places that are close to home that when you get off work, you can grab your kids or grab, you know, just your spouse or your dog and grab a fishing pole and go try to catch a fish or put on your hiking boots and go hike with your dog and just try to experience something on that front country. That front country is what we really have to protect also, so that we all have an easier time accessing. And not everybody can get in the backcountry. Not everybody is blessed to have a string of pack mules or the legs and lungs to get to those places. So front country does become so important. And you know, these access bills and some of this stuff, people say, well, this is just junk land. But if it's land that's even 80 acres, I mean, heck, I shot a deer a couple years ago on public land in Wyoming, and it was literally like an 80-acre block that, you know, I had hunted and a deer passed through, and I was able to notch a tag with private surrounding it. And having that opportunity, you know, if I didn't have that 80-acre chunk, I wouldn't have had the opportunity. I killed my deer in Montana on an 80-acre chunk of public land. You know, it's crazy to think about.
It's awesome. You know, I have a really good friend who works at Vortex Optics, and he came out here. We came out with some vets. And we, I think we took like 10 deer off of a 10-acre parcel that's about 5 minutes from downtown Sheridan. Sure. And it was unique. It was all suppressed gas guns, and we did it that way because, you know, and these were all guys who were, you know, former Tier 1 guys and Reuben. And the reason that you know, it's like you had these guys because who else, you know, the safety needed to be able to do it in those circumstances. Sure. You had to have the right guys, but it was one of my favorite experiences, and I feel personally extremely lucky to be able to, you know, not just live in Wyoming, but to be an American and to be part of this. You know, we're in a system, love it or hate it. Like, we're weighing in on this right now. Yeah. You know, where else in the world
do you have that opportunity?
Would they be making these decisions and we actually have a voice? I just feel like I couldn't be more blessed. And thank you so much for letting me come out and visit with you about it.
Yeah, and for those of you thinking to moving to Wyoming, I don't know if you've heard the wind noise on this
terrible.
Audio. It's so windy here. Yeah. You guys don't want to move here.
No, it's a nice place to visit.
It's a great place to visit, but the wind is so bad.
Yeah. Jackson is phenomenal. Go visit Jackson. They've got a hotel bed for you.
Yeah, no. I say that tongue in cheek. I'm joking. And today it's totally random because we have this east wind, which we never have an east wind. And so normally the wind would be blowing at our backs out of the northwest. And instead we have like this headstrong east wind. So we're catching it in the mic. So I apologize to all of you listening about that wind noise. But it is part of being in the beautiful landscape. And I thank you so much for joining me today. Can you send everybody to where they can listen to your podcast and then social media access for you as well?
Sure. Just go to any place you can get a podcast, whether it's Apple or Spotify or however you download your podcast, and just search Your Mountain. And why Your Mountain? Because from the beginning, when we worked for Matt Mead, we always said, like, these, you know, there are so many acres of opportunity out there. Your land, your water, your wildlife, but they all belong to you. This is your mountain. And so for all of us, that's what we all share, is that, like, your mountain is also my mountain. Yeah. And we ought to all feel extremely grateful for it.
Amen to that. And I sure do. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this podcast. And I want to appreciate all of you for tuning in to this episode of the Wild Uncut podcast. And you guys, please support the people that make this podcast possible. So we got Ruger Marlin, Safari Club International, and Onyx Hunt, and then also Bear Archery. So please, you guys, power of the purse goes into those supporting back those organizations that make things like this possible for you to further your education, hopefully empower you, give you some more resources, and get involved in this great country we live in. So thank you again for coming out and taking the time to sit down on my ranch here. Well, actually, it's called a pasture in Wyoming, but on my pasture.
Hey, it was a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for it.
Appreciate it. Thank you all for listening to the Wild and Uncut podcast. If you would like to hear more, be sure to not only watch, but subscribe to my Pursue the Wild digital series airing on Carbon TV and YouTube. And while you're at it, follow me at Kristy Titus on Facebook and Instagram.